Bruce, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm Bruce Russell, and I'm a philosophy professor at Wayne State University in Detroit. I've been there for many, many years. I work in ethics, epistemology, and philosophy of religion. Those are my specialties. I'm actually here at my place in California where I grew up, but I went to UC Davis where I got a bachelor's degree in math and ultimately a PhD in philosophy.
Cool. And so the topic today was the problem of evil. Can you tell me more about your position on that?
Sure. So I have a very simple argument. I arrive at it by considering some other versions of the problem of evil, statement of the problem of evil. I won't go into those right now, but we can get to them if you want. But the simple version I have goes like this. I assume that when we're talking about God, we're talking about an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy good being. And the argument goes like this, that if such a God exists, there wouldn't be excessive, unnecessary suffering, by which I mean way more suffering that God need allow in order to bring about certain goods or to prevent certain evils or bads. So that's the first premise. If God exists, there's excessive, unnecessary suffering. And the second premise simply says, there is. Look around at how much suffering there is of innocent people, innocent children, and the like. And it seems like it's way more than God need allow if he exists in order to bring about important goods or prevent important evils or bads. And so from those two premises, it follows by an argument form called modus tollens that God doesn't exist.
Well, and are you going for more of an evidential one or a logical problem of evil with that one?
I'm doing it evidentially because I think that the evidential problem is called that because of the second premise. In my argument, there is excessive unnecessary suffering. So I don't think that's a logically necessary truth. I just think that the best explanation for all the suffering we see is that there's way more than God would need to allow. So it's not a logical truth. The first one, I do think, the claim that if God exists, there wouldn't be excessive unnecessary suffering. I think that's necessarily true, but not the second premise. I think I justify accepting it because I think it's the best explanation of all the suffering we see in the world.
And how do you think most apologists would respond to that?
In the past, they've tried to, some of them are skeptical theists. That's a very important line. And the skeptical theists try to argue that we're in no position to judge that there's excessive unnecessary suffering. And they sometimes compare a novice at chess and he looks at what move of the masters and says, oh, that's a blunder. But then people say, well, wait a minute, he's a novice. He's in no position to judge that the master is making a blunder. So that's a standard line of defense by what are called skeptical theists.
And do you think that's an unsuccessful defense?
I do think it's unsuccessful. I respond to that argument by an analogy, and I introduce, well, there are such people, but young earthers, by which I mean a broader sense than most young earthers are taken, but somebody who thinks that the earth or the universe was created recently, maybe 6,000 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, maybe Bertrand Russell suggested this, maybe 5 minutes ago, and they say, well, we're skeptical theists of a sort ourselves, but we think that it's reasonable to believe that the earth was created recently. Why? Well, God being good is against suffering, and there'd be a lot less suffering in the universe if, people were just created recently with all of the kinds of scientific knowledge we now have. And whatever, maybe it's not so much, but whatever we've gained through interactions with each other on how to live with each other. And so they say there's a kind of sketch of the reason why, God would actually create the universe recently in order to avoid all the kind of suffering over thousands of years that animals and humans would experience on the standard account of how we got here. We got here, but we evolved is kind of the standard account, even by theists, many theists, accept evolution. But the skeptical theists say, well, there's a more direct and more humane route. God should have just made us with a bunch of this scientific knowledge and certain kind of social knowledge. And so that's why he created the world recently, but made it look like it was much older because he didn't want to make it apparent or obvious that he was the creator because that would somehow take away from human significant freedom. And so I say, well, that's their argument. And the problem is that nobody really thinks that that's a good defense, that they say we're in no position to judge if the theory is wrong. But I think everybody thinks, well, there's something absurd about that defense, that scientific evidence just makes it absurd to think that the young earthers' view is correct. But it has the very same logic and form that the skeptical theists offer. And so I said mine reply to the skeptical theists, the standard ones, not the young earthers, is an argument of arguments. If the defense of the young earthers is bad, so is your defense, skeptical theists, about being in no position to judge that there's excessive, unnecessary suffering.
So that leads to the argument that response could justify any position, any position you could possibly want to hold, because you're just simply saying that since we're not in a position to judge, God could have done anything regardless of whether or not we understood it, and so anything could possibly be justified.
Well, I think it's a weaker position, Tom, the skeptical theists say. They don't say that it could be justified. They just are giving a defense against somebody like me who's offering the argument and just saying we're in no position to judge whatever the second premise is, in my case, that there's excessive unnecessary suffering. They don't say that they're justified in thinking there's not. So there's this subtle difference between what people call a theodicy that tries to actually give a kind of defense of why and a reason why God would, allow so much suffering. They just kind of, the skeptical theists try to turn the tables on the defender of the argument from evil, say, well, we're not saying we're justified in believing why God allows all this suffering, but we just say you, atheists, are not justified in your argument, in particular in the second premise. But essentially, there are things called undercutting and overriding defeaters. And what the skeptical theists are saying is that you're in no position to judge. And that's kind of an undercutting defeater. And I give this example in my one of my papers, maybe a couple of them, that if you're in the country like I am actually right now, that suppose it's dusk and almost dark, and there's some canine-looking animal 200 yards away, and you say, oh, that's a coyote. There are coyotes here. And I say to you, well, wait a minute, it's so dark. You can't tell a coyote from the neighbor's German Shepherd. So you're in no position to judge. I'm not saying I'm justified in believing it's not a coyote, but you're not justified in believing it is, because the lighting conditions and the distance between you and the animal is too great. So that's kind of the structure of the skeptical theist attempted defeater. And it's the same kind of undercutting defeater that the young earthers employ. And so I'm saying basically that if that kind of defeater doesn't work for the young earthers, it doesn't work for you theists either.
What if they say something like it's good, suffering is good because it's required for free will or whatever, like the theodicy, or that God wants us to suffer because it's soul building something or another.
Yeah, there's this famous phrase about here's the place. John Hick, a famous philosopher of religion, used this phrase: "Earth is a place for soul building or soul making," and the reply I have is that, well, it's a good thing to have freedom, and maybe it's important if there are souls to make your soul, but there's a limit. Sometimes if the freedom is so great that it allows people to, I don't know, rape and torture little kids and the like, that's beyond the pale. That it doesn't seem reasonable that a good God would allow that in order for you to have freedom, which is needed for what? Why is it so significant that you couldn't curtail freedom, given those horrendous, horrible consequences? Certainly, that's what we think. We think, okay, we want people to have freedom of speech and action and association and the like. But we say, wait a minute, when you start raping people and torturing them and stuff, that you don't freedom isn't that good to justify allowing those kinds of horrible actions. It's good, but not that good, basically.
So I typically like to go with the argument that even if freedom was required, it's logically possible to create a world with all of the positives and at least one less negative. So, like, if I can show that there's one logically possible world where rape wasn't possible, but all of the good things, the free will, soul building, whatever else, can still be done to the same degree without rape, that would disprove God logically. I mean,
Without
logically
without
impossible.
without rape, did you say that? Is that the word
Yep.
you use?
Yep.
Um, well, my answer is the skeptical theists are going to come back at you. They're going to say, you're in no position to judge. You're like the novice chess player trying to judge the moves of the master. So I think really skeptical theism is a contender that atheists have to deal with. And I tried to in the way that I described. But otherwise, I think that's the retreat position for them to occupy.
Well, I think that you can defeat that group of people specifically by presenting a logically possible world, um, which is better, which is has all of the good things and one less bad thing. Because um, then you've proven you are not the novice chess player. It's like if I can show there's a checkmate in one move, which is there's no logically possible way for it to be a better move than that. And on chessboard, then you've won the argument. You can't get better than that. And so if I can show that there's at least one better way the world could be with all the good things and one less bad thing, then I've shown that the argument that I'm a novice can't be applied anymore because I've shown logically that there's one better possible world that God didn't pick.
I think the skeptical theists are not going to allow you that premise. That is, they're going to say, you don't know that all of the suffering and rape and so forth, the one case even, you don't know. You think it's logically possible, but for all we know, all of it, every last bit is necessary to bring about some greater good that we don't grasp. You might say you think you know. Sometimes people think they know that something, or they think they know that something is logically possible, but they find out after the mathematicians prove otherwise that they were mistaken. So you're like a novice mathematician and you're trying to make, the Nobel laureate in mathematics. You're claiming that it's logically possible, but they're saying for all you know, it is not.
But wouldn't they hold the burden of proof at that point to show that my argument has a logical contradiction? They can't just say it might that we haven't discovered yet, because that seems like if I say 1 + 1 = 2, you could say the exact same thing. Oh, well, you're just a novice. Maybe there's some logical contradiction there that we don't see yet. Clearly, that would be irrational, just like in the example you gave of saying that we don't think the world was a young Earth 6,000 years ago because of all the science. So simply saying that, well, maybe God did that, or maybe God knows a way to around that, doesn't seem sufficient to justify belief that there's a logical contradiction with 1 + 1 = 2. And so, why would it, in the case of a more general argument that a world without rape could have all of the positives and none of the negatives?
Because the answer the skeptical theist will give is because the 1 + 1 is 2 is some obvious logically necessary truth, and so 1 + 1 is 3 is a contradiction. Those things are within our ken. We have enough knowledge of simple mathematics like that to know that the 1 + 1 is 2 is a necessary truth, and it's 3 is logically contradictory. But we're not in that situation when it's between us and a Nobel laureate mathematician, and we're trying to decide on the basis of what appears to us about some complex mathematical proof that it's not contradictory. But they're going to say, to continue the analogy, that you're a novice mathematician and you're no position to judge, but you are in a position to judge 1 + 1 is 2 and 1 + 1 is 3 is contradictory. But it's not analogous because in the simple addition cases, there's no Nobel laureate mathematician that we're comparing, that we're taking our appearances to be definitive, where we can do it in the simple cases. We can't do it when somebody's saying, but there may be we think there's a mathematician, a super mathematician, and your appearance of no contradiction isn't adequate evidence to show that there really is not a contradiction.
Well, in the case of like logical contradictions, it seems like you can, because if you can write out any argument, any logical argument, you can tell whether or not it has a logical contradiction in it, right? Like it's P and not P at the same time. And so if I describe a world simply by
We
imagining it, I can't.
You can't. I bet you can't. My answer is, nor can I. And the answer is that when they proved a few years ago Fermat's last theorem, there actually were flaws in that argument that the mathematician didn't see, and other mathematicians ultimately did. But certainly no novice would have caught those flaws.
Well, that would seem like it would be.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. It's fine. It's fine. So I'm saying, like, if I can imagine a world with a square, for example, a square Lego or whatever, then it's logically possible, equally as much so as 1 + 1 = 2. Simply the fact that I can imagine it proves it's logically possible. I can't imagine a square with a round square. I can't imagine a world with a round square. That's logically impossible. And so any world that I can imagine would necessarily not entail any logical contradiction simply by virtue of the fact that I can imagine it. And so if I can imagine a world without rape and imagine it also having soul building, that proves it's not logically contradictory, seems like.
I think you're begging the question again that you can imagine it. The answer that the skeptical theists always say is, in order to be justified in believing that it's possible, you must think something like this, that all of the goods and evils, the intrinsic goods and evils you're aware of, are representative samples of all the goods and evils that there are. And they're going to say, you're not justified in believing that. How do you know that there aren't other goods and evils that God is aware of, if he exists, that you aren't? Because you're just a finite mind compared to his. And so you can't satisfy that condition that you're aware of, or you're aware of a representative sample of all the goods and evils, intrinsic goods and evils that there are. And if you're not aware of those, then you can't be sure that what seems logically possible is, because you may be leaving out consideration of those other goods and evils beyond your ken. And so you're in no position to judge. You're just judging on the basis of the evils and goods you're aware of, or a sample of them. And in addition, you don't know what's necessary for what. You don't know what's logically necessary for those other possible goods and evils of which you're not aware. So you're really not able to. You're missing a whole bunch of data, so to speak, namely the possibility of goods and evils beyond your ken.
So I think I can identify all of those without actually needing to know what they are. So, for example, whatever all the goods may be, they have to be in this world, right? Because all the goods, if this is the best world God created, all of the goods, whatever they are, must be in this world, right? Something along those lines.
No, I don't grant. I don't think you should grant. I don't think the theists should grant that. Not at all. They should say that for all you know, for all we know, is what they do say. There are other goods and evils, and especially goods that are only achievable by allowing significant freedom. And they're not in this world. They're in some other world. That's why they have to posit. Actually, I say this about Swinburne's arguments. He has to actually posit some world, because he thinks that if there were an all good God, that he wouldn't allow a life to be all in all, on balance, bad for the person. But some lives are, just looking at them in our world, bad for the person. So he thinks that's a good reason to think that if God exists, there must be an afterlife where things can be compensated. Sort of, it went bad in this world, but all in all, counting the afterlife in this world, your life is good on the whole. Because he just accepts God wouldn't allow somebody to have a life which is bad on the whole, and he realizes that some people in this world do, and so it forces him to say there must be an afterlife where things can be made better. Not in this
Right, but
world.
we have to have access to that good via this world, right? So that good, the afterlife, achieving the afterlife, is achievable via something in this world, right? So that good is still a part of this world indirectly.
I don't think so. That we're not aware of the specifics of the good. We just know that argument I gave you from Swinburne just says, well, since there are lives that are bad on the whole in this life, and there wouldn't, if God exists, there wouldn't be lives that are bad on the whole, period. So there must be some sort of goods in the afterlife that compensate. But that as soon as you allow that there are goods in the afterlife that could compensate, then this claim that you're known to judge that all the suffering in even one case, that it isn't required in order to achieve those afterlife goods. You can be aware that there are, Tom, I think, afterlife goods. Maybe you accept Swinburne's argument, but you don't know what they are and how they are related to the suffering in this world. The skeptical theist says, for all we know, the suffering is necessary to achieve those specific afterlife goods, even though we don't know the specifics of them. We just know that there are some.
So my argument is more general than I'm saying that whatever the goods are, they have to be entailed by or connected to the world as it is right now, the way it is right now, right? They have to be, all of them. There can't be a single one that's missing by the theist definition.
I think so.
So if I take the class of all things as they are now and say, before we're placed in this world, we're given the option, would you like to go to this world or go to a different one? I've now given you the option to take all of the goods. You get all of them. You just choose this world. Now I don't have to know anything about them. I don't need to know what they are, how to get them, nothing, because they're all entailed in this one set. And so I give everyone the option. You can go to this world and get all the goods, or you can opt out and say, no, I'd rather not be in a world of rape. That seems to be a moral improvement. Seems like morally, if you're given the option to get all the goods, but are not forced to, that would be a better world. And so now I've taken all of the goods. What?
Can't be done. Answer is every single thing in this world, every bit of suffering in this world is either itself necessary in order to achieve some goods in the afterlife, or even if the suffering itself is not necessary, the freedom which produced it is necessary to have its good in itself, as well as certain afterlife goods of which we don't know the specifics of. That was a bad sentence, but I think it communicates. You don't know. There's some goods that happen that James Durbert talks about. Focuses his essay on horrendous suffering that is caused by immoral actions. Yes, and the skeptical theist should say, for all we know, that doesn't mean we know the opposite, but for all we know, that having that freedom, which is good in itself, plus what it makes possible in terms of the afterlife good, all of that, allowing that freedom and its relationship to this afterlife good, is logically necessary to have both the good of that freedom and whatever those afterlife goods are, of which we don't know the details. So it is related. I give you this, Tom, that it is related, but I'm just denying that, eliminating, let's suppose we stop that person from raping the little girl, that we don't know, say the skeptical theist, that it wouldn't be better all in all, and logically required to allow that in order to achieve some goods of which we're unaware.
Well, so my argument is that let's grant that, just say that's true, and let's say without changing anything of this world at all, every
Yeah.
individual before entering this world has the option to enter it or to opt out and be like, nah, I'm not going to go to that world at all. I'm going to take none of the goods from it, none of the bads. I don't take none of it and go to a different world of my own choosing, separately, completely separate universe kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Now, you've had the option to pick all of the goods, whatever they may be. I don't need to know anything about them because I know they're necessarily entailed in whatever this world is like as it is right now. And so if you have the option to go to this world, you have the option of giving all the goods. And you can opt out and say, I don't want the goods. And so I'm dropping the goods. Don't care. And that seems to be a morally better world where you have the option to choose to enter this world as it is and accept all of the goods with all of the soul building requirements or whatever. Or you can opt out and be like, nah, I don't want to play that game. You played a bad game. I'm gonna go play my own game. That seems to be a morally superior world that has all of the goods. You have every good ever God could ever want because it's entailed in this world, and that's this world is one of the options. And you just opt out. It's like, nah, I don't want that. And that seems like a morally better world.
I don't get it. I don't know why. I don't know why you know that. I mean, I get what you think you know. but I think it's like the novice chess player saying, look, I have this choice of making all of these what I take to be good moves and none of the bad ones, and I can choose and blah blah blah. But the trouble is that you're going to give up something. You're going to make some bad moves you don't realize. That's what they're going to say if you choosing in ignorance about how these things are related. Well, then you might make mistakes in choosing. No, I'm not going to choose this world. Well, if really all these great goods are dependent on the details of this world, you shouldn't choose not to go to this world.
But that part doesn't matter because
You're
it doesn't
ignorance
matter.
now choosing. Say that
Well,
again.
it doesn't matter if we make mistakes because we have freedom. We're allowed to make mistakes. And so it may be a mistake not to choose this world, but that's not what's important. What's important is it moral? Is it more moral to allow us to have the option to choose God's design world with all the benefits or to opt out? And I'd say, yes, it is more moral to give us the option than to force us into it without our consent. Therefore, if God could give us the option to enter his world with all the goods and the bads, or to opt out and go to our own, which may or may not be a mistake, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
Then that's a more moral world that has all of the goods that are in God's world, but one greater good because you have the option to choose it or opt out. And therefore, even if it's a mistake to opt out, it's a more moral world that has all of the goods, which is the only condition required to defeat the skeptical theist, which is, can you posit a world with more moral goods and all of the goods God has? And I can say, yes, I can do that.
Well, okay, so that's a different argument. I have to think about this some more, but my first thought is it changes the subject because the subject could a God, from the problem of evil, I mean, the question is, could an all good, all knowing, all powerful God create a world like this? And so you're raising another option. Well, maybe he would have done this other scenario, had this other scenario. But it seems to me that I don't know that just like we as parents might, create children and treat them well and have some plan, for their lives and so forth, that we couldn't be faulted even if we didn't somehow. Where did we get these free choosers? They had to come from somewhere. And so on your scenario, they had to come from somewhere. But my thought is that as parents, we could create children and, have a kind of life outline for them, including freedom, that we couldn't be faulted for doing that, even if it would be better somehow there were children that just came from nowhere chose their own life, it doesn't seem to me to speak to the issue about whether God is somehow, if he existed, he couldn't do this, or somehow blameworthy or something for couldn't be an all good God if he created a world like this. That seems to be the central issue about the problem of evil. And it's not about whether there is a better world that had free beings choosing their world. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about this, Tom, but I think it changes the subject. And then it's a new subject. And then that subject gets difficult because then the question is, where did those free beings come from? Weren't they created by something or someone? And now we're off on a different tangent. But I think it misses the focus of the problem of evil. Is there something kind of blameworthy in a God, creating a world like ours?
Well, I think the goal with it is to say that if I can show there's one morally better world and God didn't create that world, then God can't be perfectly moral, kind of a thing. And so if I give an example that has all of the goods and one more good or one less evil, and God didn't create that world, then God can't be perfectly moral. He chose to do something that isn't the most moral possible outcome, disproving that God is either perfectly good or all powerful or whatever. And so
Hmm.
my goal with that is to show I can create a model that has all of the goods, regardless of whether or not I know them. I don't need to know any of the goods
Yeah.
because I know that they're entailed in this world in some way. And so if I have this world as a set, I have all of the goods. And now that I have that as a plain piece of my logical argument, I can defeat the skeptical theist because I can now address any argument they have because I have all of the goods, regardless of whether or not I know them. I have them all in this argument, and I can use that as a plain piece to then posit a better world. Where can I choose, as for example, the one I like is give people the option to choose world A or world B with the goods, without the goods, and so the goal with this argument is simply to show that you can address the skeptical theists by having a way to entail all of the possible goods, even without knowing what they are.
Yeah, I don't know. So, Tom, I think your argument is along the same lines that you started with, but I haven't heard this argument before. So I think it's different from the first one you gave me. And I kept trying to defend the skeptical theist response in that one, because there was one where you're saying, I can imagine a world just like this, but say one less rape or something like that. And I said, hold on now. You may not be able to imagine that. And then I brought in, I don't know, first the novice chess player, then the novice mathematician versus, and so I thought the skeptical theist has a good answer to you, saying, no, you're really assuming that these things you imagine really are logically possible, but your finite mind doesn't really justify you believing that. So I think that's the right answer that the skeptical theist should give to those standard replies. I don't know. I don't know, Tom. I mean, maybe it'll work out. I'm just skeptical that on the end that this this choice from a person, I guess the idea is God creates various worlds and he says, would you like this one? Would you like that one? Or something like that. And then maybe he creates free beings and then it's like a smorgasbord and then they can pick worlds off it. I guess that's your picture. I don't know what to say, Tom. I have to think about that more. You get my point. I'm just trying to do my best for the opponents. I think it's the right thing
Yep.
to do, to be charitable intellectually. And in the initial responses you gave, I tried to give what I thought was the best skeptical theist response.
Yeah, that was usually just my hierarchy tree of how my argument grew to come to that conclusion. Was I started with this classical replies, and then I
Yeah,
agree. I think that the skeptical theist has a reasonable response to just removing rape or whatever as a particular example, but I
yeah,
don't think they have a reasonable response to what that led my argument to
yeah.
become, which is the version it is now. And I've had many skeptical theists on, and I
Mhm.
don't think they've
Well,
given an
maybe
adequate
so.
response to that.
Maybe so. My argument is that I was just doing the analogy with the young earthers, so that's my attempt at defeat them. It's still up to me, as I say in some of my papers and others who defend the problem of evil, to suppose you say the skeptical theists say you're in no position, Russell, to judge that there's excessive unnecessary suffering. Okay, and so I says, well, I don't know. You better not say that because then the young earthers are going to come on the scene and you're going to be reduced to an absurdity. Still, I have a burden of proof to explain why I'm justified in it, even if they're wrong in saying I'm not justified. That doesn't follow that I am justified. So I still have a burden of proof there. And, you know, ultimately I fall back on inference of the best explanation. There is this fact of all this suffering in the world. What's the best explanation? There really is excessive unnecessary suffering? Or no, there's a God who has a hidden plan which we can't grasp and all that. I think that second hypothesis is not the best explanation, contrary to what Swinburne thinks. And so inference of the best explanation comes in for me importantly to defend the second premise in my argument.
Gotcha. Yep, I understand that. What do you? I've heard that inference of the best explanation is affirming the consequent. Have you heard that before?
It does say that, but it's not. The point is that, you know, let's see if we can think of a case. I don't know. Let's think maybe about planetary motion. I don't know. Here's all the if the sun goes around the Earth, then we'd observe all these things through telescopes about, you know, planets and all that stuff. We do observe all these things about planets and so forth, and therefore the sun goes around the Earth. Or let's do the other. The Earth goes around the sun. Let's update. If the Earth goes around the sun, then we observe all these things. We do observe all these things through telescopes and like. Therefore, the Earth goes around the sun, affirming the consequent. No, it doesn't work that way. It just says, look, there's all this data, and what's the best explanation of the data? I often use the example, a simple one of you see footprints on the beach in the water's edge, you know, and they look like human footprints, but there's no human around. Well, what's the best explanation for these footprints? Well, one is that some guy has a trained monkey, bought some rubber feet, took the monkey out to the beach and had him walk along the beach. That's one explanation. The other explanation is some person recently walked on the beach. And they're two competitors. And well, we think the best explanation is somebody recently walked there. And so it's not affirming the consequent. It's not trying to say because you observe this data, therefore the hypothesis is true. It just says when they're competing hypotheses, the one that measures up to whatever the standard of best explanation is, that's a really tough question. That's the best explanation, and it's epistemically relevant. That is, it gives you reason to believe that hypothesis over the competitors.
Gotcha. What do you say about the intelligent design argument that you can see design in certain things like a BMW or whatever, and you can infer design from it? How would you respond to that argument typically?
Yeah, well, you know, I thought the design argument was a lot better before Darwin came along. You know, the standard ones, people looked at the eye and saw the complex structures in the eye and said, well, what the heck? Either best explanation or something like that. It must be some designer that made the eye. But then, wait a minute. Darwin says, wait a minute, we don't need at least immediately, we don't need a designer. You know, there's this evolutionary theory. It acts kind of like a blind watchmaker, but it's not a watchmaker. It's just, you know, whatever physical laws go to produce ultimately humans and eyes and the like. Okay, so then it works back. The worry then, the focus when I think Darwin comes along, the focus is no longer like the eye or things in the universe that have structure, because a lot of those can be explained analogously to how Darwin explained the structure in the eye. But now, what about the fundamental laws? This is what Swinburne looks on. The focus now gets broader. It's not on things in the universe. They grant that those things can be explained scientifically. But what about the structure of the universe? Well, there are several things to say about that. So Swinburne tries to say the best explanation for the regularities that are described by the laws of nature is that there was some creator who made the whole universe, not things in the universe, but the universe itself orderly? And my answer is before you get to the problem of evil, first I want to know, is the creator also good besides being all powerful? Oh, then you get the problem of evil. And, well, then it doesn't seem that's so odd. Okay, so now suppose we just put aside the problem of evil and say, well, what about the structure of the universe? So just to be clear, initially I think that there are things in the universe that display marks of design. Ultimately, they get a scientific explanation. So then you have to move up if you're going to defend some design argument or something like it. You have to move up to the structure of the universe. I'm just reviewing what I said a moment ago. Okay, so then I think, well, let's look at the details of this. It's an immaterial being, and we don't really know why it created this universe rather than some other. And so there's still some things left unexplained, because maybe, this creator could have created another one. So why do we have this universe rather than some other? It doesn't answer that question. The problem, I think, is that if you say it's an intelligent being, there are two problems. One is that as far as we know, intelligence is dependent on some physical structures like the brain, and not the other way around. It's not we're intelligent because we have some immaterial soul, but it's because the brain actually is the source of our intelligence. Do we have empirical evidence? Yes. Let people have brain damage, or they have Alzheimer's or something like that. How come their kind of mental capacities diminish if you affect what goes on in brains? So it suggests that intelligence is actually founded on some physical structure rather than the other way around. Secondly, there's a famous mind-body problem about how can immaterial beings interact with matter. Descartes said, oh, I've got the answer. It's at the pineal gland. No, that wasn't the question. It wasn't where, it was how. How in the heck could that happen? That there's something that's not in space and time, and yet it interacts with things that are in space and time. Well, God may be in time. That's a controversial issue, but it's not in God. Immaterial beings are not in space. Now, how in the heck could that happen? So it introduces the creator hypothesis, introduces a mystery in order to try to solve a problem. That is, it tries to solve the problem. Why does the universe have the structure it has by introducing an immaterial being who's the cause of it? But that's introducing mystery to explain something that really doesn't explain. Just to finish up, often there's this famous example. People say, why does opium cause sleep? Answer simple. It has dormitive powers. Wait a minute, that wasn't a very good explanation. And it's even worse when it comes to an immaterial being, because we think, okay, dormitive powers, we'll look further into it. We'll see that it's really morphine, and morphine has this chemical structure and it interacts with neurons. And okay, it promises a detailed explanation. But the immaterial soul or immaterial being explanations always have this problem. They're kind of introduced mysteries, unsolvable ones. It's kind of mysterious. What is this dormitive power stuff? But it's not like forever mysterious. It promises a way to be solved, or details can be filled in. But that's not true with an immaterial being causing things to happen. So putting the problem of evil aside, my problem with an immaterial being creating the universe is that it seems to give an explanation, but when you dig down, it really introduces mystery to explain.
So my steel man of the intelligent design argument is that, like, if we suppose we saw a alien spaceship that was landed on the beach, it's clearly technologically way beyond anything humans could make. We didn't see any aliens though. No aliens, just the spaceship. It's got some joysticks, seat, buttons, and stuff. It seems like we could rationally infer it was designed. There's some property in this structure that is we can use to infer design. And if there is such a property, then that property could be in other things like DNA or the laws of physics potentially. And if it was, we could then infer those things were designed. And so what the argument that I think the intelligent designers are typically making is that we do see there's this property of design in things like a BMW that we could then
Yeah.
potentially identify in a spaceship, and that same property could then be identified in DNA. And so, how would you respond to that kind of an argument?
Well, I think it just marches back, like I was kind of suggesting. So, what explains the structure in DNA? Well, there's something else that explains that, and so ultimately, I think what explains things are the laws of nature and the initial conditions in the universe. Given these initial conditions and the laws of nature, you're going to get these results. Of course, there's a whole bunch of uh, very complicated things that went on. So we can't sort of with our finite minds know every one of the steps. And there's also physicists think that at least at the subatomic level, randomness. So you have to factor in laws of nature, initial conditions in the universe, and randomness. And those three things are ultimately going to explain, I think, whatever structure you find in the universe, starting with the eye going to, I don't know, evolutionary theory, or starting or getting to DNA and explaining why DNA has the structure it has. All of it ultimately is going to be in terms of some physical, facts and randomness in the universe. And that's why, Tom, I switched, because I was going quickly and giving what I thought it was a scientific explanation for most of these phenomena that have kind of the marks of design in them, and saying, well, ultimately, then people like Swinburne are going to challenge you to explain, why do we have these laws of nature? And then I was giving the explanation about where ultimately I think that one appeals to mystery kind of surreptitiously.
I think the laws of physics one and the biological one are two separate cases I would address separately. Like the laws of physics one, I would say, well, if it's going to be determined by a god of some kind, that can be determined by a necessary law of quantum mechanics or quantum field of some kind, and that could explain the laws. Or the laws could be a result of a further law we have yet to discover, which causes them all to be intertangled in such a way that if you change one, they will all proportionally change due to something like the fine structure constant. And so they'll all necessarily have the same proportional range to one another. And that would fully explain the fine tuning just fine. And then if you want to say, well, why does it have that particular structure? I can just say the same thing about God. And so it leads to an infinite regress argument. But I find the biological one interesting because I think they have a point when they say that there is something that we can see that we can use to identify design. When we look at a BMW or we look at an alien ship, there's clearly some difference between that and just a rock. Like we probably would not infer that this was a result of a natural process. And if there is such a category out there of a justifiable inference that this is design, it's potentially justifiable to say DNA was like that. Now, obviously, I agree with you. I think DNA is a result of evolution, abiogenesis. Those are the more plausible explanations because of the evidence we have that indicates those through novel predictions and the work in biology. But I think that the intelligent design movement does have a point that there may be this property of design, whatever it may be, that we can identify in things, and that's the part that I think is the most interesting, strongest part of their argument. And I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that. Is there this property of design that we can see in objects like BMWs or spaceships? And if so, how would you address that part?
Let me ask you a question first, Tom. I'll respond. But you were distinguishing the DNA to the physics cases. Why? What was the reason for you? I was trying to lump them together, but
Well, I think that
just
it's kind of like,
laws of nature that either are biological or physical, and so they account for the apparent design.
well, I think in the case of physics, instead of simply saying that you're positing a mystery to solve a greater mystery or something, we can just posit a better explanation, like it's just a quantum law, a quantum field, something kind of like that,
Mm.
and that would explain the the consistency of the laws of physics just fine. Like, what's the problem with saying it's determined by another law that we haven't discovered yet? Problem solved. And so there's no need for a god to explain the fine tuning of the physics whatsoever. And there's going to be two options. It's either determined by something, a god or another law, or it's going to be random. And so if they're going to assert God is the determining factor for the laws of physics, we can just assert a different determining factor, problem solved. Whereas the DNA, I think the DNA argument is more compelling because it does very much seem like a language, like a code, and the codes that we see are typically made by minds, and so it's much more relatable to people. It's much more compelling to people than the laws of physics, which most people don't understand. And so I think that the way to address them in a way that is relatable to most people is very different. Whereas if you address them in the same way, it has a different effect on people than taking more time to really think about the biological side than the physics side. Physics side's easy, just posit a different alternative determining factor.
I think I get it. So I don't know. People think about the double helix. Isn't that really, design like itself that requires explanation? And I was trying to say yes, and it has a I don't know, a physical explanation too. But let me try to address the question you asked. I was just trying to get clear about you're making that distinction. So do I think that there are sort of signs or marks of design? Isn't that basically your question? How do I address those?
Yeah, like so if we
Okay.
see a spaceship, there seems to be a design, something we can identify there.
Yeah. But then you think there's also those things that have the appearance of design in the natural world. Is that what you're going to grant, or do you want me to address that?
I'm not sure what you mean, the parents of design.
Well, I mean, like you look at well, people back before Darwin, people looked at the eye and said, "Whoa, that
Oh yeah.
look, it's kind of like you know," or even I always say to my students, "Well, look at the body; it's got all of these parts, these vital organs that fit together and they keep the person alive, and legs that let them walk from here to there, and the brain that lets us think, and blah blah blah, and it all fits together pretty nicely. Geez, that's as complex as the eye, the whole human body." So anyway, there seem like there are lots of what I call marks of design, by which I mean that they have relevant similarities to things we know were designed, like a watch designed by human, and maybe not one, maybe many watchmakers or computers or BMW or any of that kind of stuff. So they have similarities. The things in nature are similar in certain respects to things we know were the product of intelligent designers. And my answer is, and there are a lot of things in nature where the proximate, the sort of near cause, is not clearly not an intelligent designer. Just think about snowflakes. They have a lot of complex structure in them, but they're obviously caused by atmospheric conditions, which are not in themselves intelligent. And so it's like I often use this example of a Van Gogh painting, and one by Van Gogh, and there's this other painter who's a forger I call Van Faux, and Van Faux paints a lot of paintings. And now you look at this painting that I say is in the Van Gogh style, and you say to him, "Okay, what's the likelihood it's a Van Gogh?" Well, yes, if there's only Van Gogh around, painting in that style, it's pretty likely it's a Van Gogh. But what if you also have lots of examples of Van Goghs around, and have the same kind of similarity to genuine Van Goghs? It makes a lot of difference whether it's rational now for you to believe, oh, this new painting, because it has that style, is a Van Gogh. So I just say the same thing when it comes to proximate causes, at least. If we have a lot of examples of things that are created proximately by unintelligent forces, when we see some other thing in nature or wherever, wait a minute, we have to worry about all those Van Foes. Those are, the ones that are caused by, I don't know, atmospheric conditions and the like. And yes, we do have examples of watches and computers and so forth, but wait a minute, those are just Van Goghs. And so my thing is, my idea is that, yes, there is the appearance of design, because these things in nature have features and structures similar to things we know were created by intelligent beings. But it weakens the argument considerably when you also realize there are a lot of things in nature we're sure that the proximate causes, the nearby causes, were unintelligent forces. Those are Van Foes. And we didn't have, maybe we had not so many Van Foes around way back when, but now we have lots of them. And it seems like we're discovering more and more all the time. And yes, we do know that there are some things, BMWs, spaceships, watches, and so forth, that we reasonably believe they're created by intelligent designers. But that doesn't settle the issue when you have a lot of Van Foes around.
Well, yeah, that's the question I think is the most interesting one. Like if we discovered a spaceship on Mars or something that we know we didn't make, can't be human. What is it about those kinds of objects that we could use to infer that they were in fact designed as opposed to a product of natural processes we just don't understand yet? And where is the transition point? Like if we saw certain kinds of crystals, like a gigantic crystal, I imagine we'd probably say that was just a product of natural processes. But if we
Yeah.
saw something with literal joysticks and seats, we'd say that's probably not a product of natural processes.
Yeah.
And so, what is the property we're looking for, and how do we identify it in those kinds of things to tell the difference between whether we can infer design or infer it was an
Yeah.
unknown natural process?
So it varies along a spectrum, according to me, that there are some cases that are clearly so similar in their details that we're justified in believing intelligent design. There are other things that are more like things we know in nature now were not caused by intelligent design, and those we should think not designed. And then there is a gray area between those two ends. It's like heaps, the concept heap is vague. Clearly, this big amount of beans is a heap of beans. 3 beans is not a heap. And then there's this gray area in the middle where I think there's no fact of the matter whether it's a heap or not. At least I don't think we're justified in believing it's a heap or not a heap in that gray area. So that's my answer. It's this specific similarity, joysticks and all these other things made out of certain material that we've never seen in nature like that, shaped and put together aluminum or something like that. We don't see aluminum. We see rocks from which we can take aluminum, but we don't see aluminum in nature. And so it's these specific similarities to things we know were the product of design that makes us justified in believing the spaceship was designed. And if they're pretty much like things that we know were created by natural forces here on Earth, then we're justified in believing they were not created by design. And then there's a gray area in the middle, and that's just the facts. There's a gray area in the middle, just like with heaps.
Gotcha. And what's your position on morality? Objective morality, is there such a thing? Can God ground objective morality?
Yeah, so my answer is there definitely is. I tell my students, look, morality is just like math. You have to learn it. Doesn't mean that you already know it, but there are some objective moral facts. I don't know. The famous example of philosophers love is torturing kids for the fun of it is wrong, or genocide is wrong, or there are all kinds of examples that I think they're objectively true. Of course, it goes back to the famous Euthyphro dilemma when it comes to bringing in God about it. So I don't think that having an objective morality requires the existence of God. In fact, I think the Euthyphro dilemma, which basically says that, well, are things good because God commands them or right, or are they good independently? And I think if you say they're good because God commands them or right because God commands them, then it leaves open that he could command torturing kids for the fun of it. And that would be right. That seems absurd. So it seems like there's some independent standard of good. And of course, God doesn't violate it any more than he thinks can make 2 + 2 = 5.
Would something being right because God commanded it, would that make morality inherently subjective because it's contingent on opinions and intuitions, and so it wouldn't even count as a basis of objective morality at that point?
I think let's see. The first response I think the defenders should say of a divine command theory is that a good God couldn't command those things. And so it's a solution supposedly to God couldn't make torturing kids for fun right because he's good. and a good God is logically incompatible for him to command those things. I think it just pushes back the issue. Then what makes God good and therefore unable to command, torturing kids for fun? And I think then the Euthyphro dilemma just reappears. Is he good because he approves things? And then that would open up subjectivism again, because he could seem like he could approve anything. And then he says, "Oh, I approve this and I meet that standard, so I'm good." And then I don't know, off he goes on to commanding things to make him right. So I think ultimately, Tom, my answer is that it does make morality subjective, finally, even if it kind of can avoid the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma when it comes to obligations. It has to fall back on God's goodness, and then I think it succumbs.
So what about if it was grounded in his nature and has nothing to do with his opinion? His opinion is just a post hoc. So it's like his nature says
Yeah.
this is good, and then because of his nature, he will then have the opinion that this is good, but his opinion will have no effect on the goodness one way or the other.
Mhm.
Would that make it potentially objective?
My answer is I don't understand actually that response. The nature, the only way I think that his nature prevents him from, I don't know, approving this or commanding that, is because it's a hidden appeal to God's moral nature. So I otherwise, if he just his nature, what do you mean? Is being all knowing and all powerful? Well, I don't get why those things would limit him. And so I think it's just a covert appeal, his nature, to meaning, I mean his moral nature. And then you're back with the dilemma, again. So I don't get that answer. I think it's not a legitimate answer, because it doesn't work unless you um, assume that it's God's nature, his moral nature we're talking about.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was a really great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Um, Yeah, so how can you find out more? I guess one way is you can just, I don't know, Google Bruce Russell and see what he's written. I should have a better vita available to people than I do. But I don't know, I write in epistemology and ethics, and mostly meta-ethics. Those are questions about, I don't know, their moral facts and how do you know them, stuff like that. And the problem of evil, and I don't know, and really about, you can look in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I have an entry on a priori justification and knowledge. I talk about a lot of things about a priori justification because I think it's a central um, part of philosophy. I think philosophy is mostly an a priori discipline. And so you can get in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you can get a hint. There's I don't know, papers, I don't know, Google Bruce Russell and you'll see some of my papers. I'm working on
Awesome.
a book for intro called Philosophy by Example, because I love using examples when I do philosophy. And it's called Philosophy by Example, an introduction to analytic philosophy. So let's hope in a year or so you'll be able to see that.
Awesome. And we do have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Tim West asks, can you ask Bruce what important idea he changed his mind about during his career and what made him change his mind?
I can think of a specific example. It's kind of a technical area in philosophy, but there are some people, I do epistemology, like I said a moment ago, and there are some people who support something called pragmatic encroachment. By that, they mean that there are pragmatic reasons that can affect the standards of justification and knowledge. And example is, there's a famous simple little example about Hannah wants to bank her check on Friday. She has a very good reason because she's been there many times to her bank that'll be open on Saturday. She's thinking about going home and avoiding the lines, and there's nothing really at stake. And so she has enough information from past behavior. Maybe she even reads the door, bank open, earlier days, bank open on Saturday. She then goes home, and she seems justified. It seems she knows the bank's going to be open on Saturday, given all of her evidence. However, now imagine something's at stake, something really important. They've kidnapped her daughter, and if she, doesn't have the money in the bank by Saturday, they're going to kill her daughter. And so now you think, oh, wait a minute, now she doesn't know that the bank is open on Saturday. And I used to think that that was true, that the standards for knowledge and the standards for justification go up as the stakes go up. I no longer think it's true. And I changed my mind about that. That's one of the things. I kind of changed the way I do philosophy. When I was in graduate school, I started writing on a Kierkegaard, and I had a lot of, courses in phenomenology and existentialism. And I came to Wayne State. It's a center of analytic philosophy. And I sort of learned how to do analytic philosophy at Wayne State. And so my kind of approach to philosophy changed radically when I came to Wayne State after, a number of years and got sort of used to the way my colleagues were doing philosophy. So there's a little example of a specific one where I changed the view in epistemology. And this general change occurred when I went from graduate school to being a professor.
Nice. Perfect answer. Mr. Kreening asks if you have ever dealt with the problem of evil from an eternal ignorance model of sin, like in the Buddhist Hindu style of the problem of evil.
I haven't, so I'd like to hear. I don't know if the questioner could say more. Is he just able to chat?
They're able to chat. I don't know if he could join the stream and ask or not.
Yeah.
I don't think that's possible, but he is debating it with another person who's very well versed, Church of Entropy, in the chat right now.
I always thought that Buddhism, but there are many strands of Buddhism that doesn't really accept. It doesn't believe there's a God, and so I don't know where the problem of evil comes in. Some people talk to me and think I am talking about a different problem than they are. Psychology friends of mine will sometimes be asking the question, why is there evil? And they want a psychological explanation of why people are evil. But that's not really the kind of classic problem of evil talked about in philosophy or religion. That's about, like I've been saying, how is the existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy, good God compatible with all of the evil we see in the world? So I don't know whether that's an attempt to address this kind of psychological issue. Why are people evil? Buddhists have something to say about that, but I don't take it to be addressing the same thing I'm calling the problem of evil.
Yeah, I think he put a clarification. He says it's about how life becomes a quest of why I'm here in this world of suffering without a God to blame. Like how do you attribute the fact that there is suffering without a God to blame?
I think people are just probably for evolutionary reasons selfish, not only selfish, but partly selfish. And their selfishness explains a lot of the evil they do. And then I think just natural disasters cause suffering. If you consider that evil as in the problem of evil, it often is. It's kind of a problem of bad anyway, I think. But it just, as happens when it comes to natural evils. We're just little, fleshy things. And when you have fires and earthquakes and disease, we suffer. The other kind of suffering, I think, is often caused because although people aren't solely self-interested, they certainly are, and they cause evil in the pursuit of self-interest.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for the questions. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.